We are back again with Joti Brar here to talk about the World Anti Imperialist Platform. Joti's recently been in South Korea, or fake Korea, depending upon which nomenclature you want to use. And there was a meeting of the platform there, and she was obviously joined us before to talk about the meeting in Venezuela. So, Joti, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex.
And the question of Korea, North and South, and the drive to provocation and war by US imperialism against the DPRK is obviously a big one concerning anybody who's following the global shifts and changes that are going on at the moment. First of all, what was your impression of South Korea, and what was your experience of meeting the comrades there, and what did you experience whilst you were out there?
A big question. So a lot of different things I noticed in South Korea. I mean, on the one hand, you sort of see, like anywhere, there's a sense of, on the surface, calm and order and things carrying on in the usual way, despite the fact that, as we know, the war tensions are being ratcheted up on the Korean Peninsula to a most really frenzied height. And they have they've switched, from a moderately repressive to a very fascistically repressive regime, and that's obviously having its effect. We saw where there's some of the evidence of poverty of Korean workers we saw in the queues. There's a temple in the center of Seoul where they give out free food, and the queues to access that food are very, very long indeed. And that's always a sign that the economy is taking a nosedive, just like we're seeing food bank queues all over Europe. What I found interesting was meeting the comrades of the South Korean revolutionary movement, the comrades of the People's Democracy Party, who were hosting us while we were there, active in many different spheres. I met women comrades and working class trade union representatives. I met people who were members of peasant organizations, people who were in environmental organizations, people in community organizations, people in student organizations. And all of them were telling me that they feel the kind of revolutionary situation really rapidly maturing at this point, that although everything looks calm on the surface, they feel, in their daily lives and in their political life, that things are reaching a very explosive moment kind of very soon. They're expecting a kind of revolutionary outbreak and war to come together very soon and very decisively. That's really the impression I got from talking to the comrades who were working there. I saw that there was a kind of dystopian sense that I got from the city centres where there was, or the areas of working class housing. It felt like a factory, the way they're expected to live, because very small apartments in huge tower blocks, and the tower blocks are so many and so close together with nothing green around them, that they literally just have numbers on the side that go up to like past 100. So you're talking like 100, more than 100 tower blocks, all grey, all, totally uniform, high, next to each other, nothing green around. It's really, just very factory-like dormitory conditions. Interestingly, for a country that's so where the people are so sort of repressed and pushed down, they still retain certain of their cultural habits. That obviously Korea has a ancient culture. The Korean kind of national identity, if you like, not bourgeois national, but kind of cultural identity goes back for 5,000 years. And as we know, is very common in Eastern cultures. They're very, very clean. So one thing that particularly was noticeable was, bathrooms, in public bathrooms where there's nobody seems to be around looking after it, spotlessly clean. And that's something that you don't often see around the world. And in my experience, I've only previously found that in socialist countries. So for me, that's clearly a very cultural thing, that, you know, people feel the great need to take care of everything. You know, everybody's meticulous about taking their shoes off when they go into places, cleaning up behind themselves. So they still have a great kind of, you know, culturally social conscience that I found, you know, just quite interesting, considering the general level of kind of alienation and degeneration of the culture because of the conditions they're living in. We saw a statue in one place to a boy who set fire to himself as a kind of last desperate act of protest. He was only in his very early 20s, I think. He'd worked since a young lad with textile workers who were mainly women, very young, in incredibly harsh conditions. He had tried to unionize and then been kicked out, and in a last attempt to try to draw attention to the horrific working conditions of these super oppressed workers in South Korea, he had immolated himself, and there's a statue to him outside the place where he used to work, on the spot where he set fire to himself. And those type of working conditions haven't gone away for the people of South Korea. You know, it's a country that's always, or a part of the world that's always held up to us as a kind of, you know, a model of how brilliantly capitalism works, you know, and that's been the attempt of the imperialists to turn it into a kind of shiny, you know, technological place. And certainly, you know, there's a lot of technology embedded into people's everyday lives, but the standard of living and the poverty that's being endured by people, and that, you know, they're really suffering under the current economic crisis, has come on top of, you know, the last economic crisis never went away. And so, you know, standard of living for ordinary Korean people is sinking very fast. And there's a real sense of desperation amongst a lot of workers there. I will just come to Gwangju, if I may, because the first half of our trip to South Korea was to Gwangju. And many people outside of Korea have never heard of this city, but it's a city that's at the heart of South Korea's independence and liberation and reunification movement. And in 1980 in Gwangju, there was an armed uprising. Now, most of the people, even in the West, even people who care about revolutionary things, most people don't know about this event. But there was an armed uprising which started with a student response to a newly fascistic rule in the country that was very, very heavy-handed and brought in martial law. But it spread very rapidly across the whole region. And 100,000 people took part in that uprising, which I was like, was armed. It wasn't just a demonstration, it was an armed uprising, which succeeded in forcing the troops and all the forces of the state out of the city. And they had, for 10 days, they had a self-run commune. Workers were involved, peasants were involved, not just the students. The whole city became a kind of liberated zone that started to, you know, was holding mass meetings every day and starting to talk about, you know, what were their demands and how could they run their lives and all the rest of it. It was brutally suppressed, as you can imagine, with very much under the orders of the US occupiers. And of the 100,000 people who participated, 5,000 were slaughtered. And there's a cemetery which for the dead, which initially was a secret ceremony, cemetery. The people had to find and bury their dead in secret. Years later, a more reformist government came in, and this has been the history of South Korea since US occupation in 1945. They sort of flip-flop between different faces of proxy government. So sometimes the the proxy government, which is they're all totally loyal to US imperialism and really under instruction from US imperialism, but sometimes they look more reformist and sometimes they're just, you know, all out fascistic, depending on the needs of the times. So under a more reformist government at a certain point, the site was officially adopted by the state, by the city, and sort of made nice, and now it's a destination for people. But what's really interesting is the legacy, the memory of this uprising in Gwangju means that there's a kind of, it's, if you like, there's something like the Gwangju rules. This legacy can't be ignored or sat upon or denied. It's commemorated every year. It broke out on the 18th of May. They call it 518. And while we were there, it was the week leading up to the commemorations. And what that meant, the whole city was decked in banners. I mean, I saw a tower block that had a pink 518 banner from the top story down to the ground, a huge banner advertising the commemorations for 518, right? And this at a time when the government is totally fascistic and anti-people and pro-USA, but they can't stop these things. For fear of the consequences being, you know, it's bad enough that the memory is alive, but if you try and repress too hard in Gwangju, you don't know what you're playing with. The revolutionary spirit there is very strong. So it was Gwangju that the PDP decided was where the platform would be able to hold its mass rally. And in Gwangju, you can make speeches about reunification and liberation in a way that you can't in Seoul, for example. So there's a really interesting kind of reality on the ground of what it means when the balance of class forces is such that even the most repressive government has to think twice about what it does in case of backfiring. You know, they're not, even the most fascistically brutal regime is not always as strong as it looks when the people are also moving and strong. You know, so that's a really interesting, I think, practical lesson. You know, we had, for example, the Lee Jiok, who's the permanent representative of the peace treaty movement, gave a very fiery speech about the DPRK and reunification to our rally, you know, which was in public in Gwangju, a beautiful speech. And I would suggest people to go and find it on the World Anti Imperialist Platform's YouTube channel. But, you know, you couldn't do that in other parts of Korea or South Korea without getting repressed. But somehow the Gwangju rules means that you've got a bit more leeway for how you express yourself. A lot of people might not realize there's a law in Korea, in South Korea, called the National Security Law. Incredibly repressive. Again, it's been there since the US occupiers basically brought it in the earliest days of their occupation. So the USA has been occupying South Korea since 1945, despite the fact that the people of Korea were on the Allies' side in World War II. They were the victorious side. They had just succeeded in kicking out their Japanese occupiers who had been occupying Korea since 1910. Right? So they'd had 25 years of quite brutal, very brutal, Japanese occupation. They had fought very hard against that. It's 35, isn't it? I can't count. They had fought very hard against that. There's many heroes of the anti-Japanese liberation struggle. They won. In 1945, the Soviets came into the top half of Korea and the Americans came into the bottom half, but it was supposed to be a temporary, you know, we're just helping to make sure the Japanese are really gone and, you know, we're all on the same side and in a few years we'll be gone and you'll be left to run your own affairs. And of course, the Soviets left North Korea. The Americans never left the South. They set up a puppet regime. They enforced the border. It's really interesting how we're always told that it's North Korea that isolates itself, which of course couldn't be further from the truth. And interestingly, if you go to the border of North Korea and look at it, what you will see is the fence is on, and the barbed wire and the lookout posts and all that, and the militarization is all on the South Korean side. On the North Korean side, there is no fence, right? There's all kinds of laws against North Korea in the South, that don't exist in the North. As far as the North is concerned, they want to reunite their people. Anyone who comes north is welcome. But of course, the problem is if you go north from the South, then you can't go back again. Right? It's against the law to go to the North if you're in the South. That's not true in the North, but it's just obviously you can't get back again because of the regime in the South. But the national security law that was brought in by the occupiers essentially makes it it's a kind of a thought crime law, right? Expressing any sympathy towards, or even almost saying the name of North Korea or its leadership gets you repressed. And what that means, you're not allowed to meet with anybody from the North in any capacity, no matter what you do. So what that means is the comrades in the People's Democracy Party, who are struggling to build a revolutionary organization to help with the national liberation and national reunification of their country, they are not able to coordinate with their comrades of the Workers' Party of Korea in the North. They're not even able to have any communication whatsoever. And they know that the tentacles of the Korean security state are everywhere. Even the PDP's leadership in exile in Paris does not meet with North Korean diplomats in Europe, because they know that's one thing that would get their party suppressed in South Korea. If they could show any evidence whatsoever of contact between the PDP and the Workers' Party of Korea, although they are parties representing the working class of the same nation, that will get them repressed. And the revolutionaries of South Korea have had their organizations repressed many times over. The People's Democracy Party is the latest iteration of the legal, front of their struggle, which was founded relatively recently, only in I forget the date. Sorry, I'm not brilliant with those things. Maybe 2016, something like that. So you can look on Wikipedia and go, oh, they're just a new party. Where did they come from? But you have to understand the continuation of their struggle is constantly shifting depending on their conditions.
So the actual reality is that whereas we are told in the West that the DPRK is a prison house, is a prison nation, where everybody has to be fenced in, where there is a security state that terrorizes people who talk about reuniting with the South, it's actually the opposite. The opposite is true, which is that the South Koreans are fenced in and forbidden from communicating to the North and forbidden from even looking at it. So the big question is, of course, then, well, what are they afraid of? Because we're told constantly in the West, and this is the only knowledge you will have of the DPRK growing up, certainly the only knowledge I have, was that it was this prison camp that was all there where everybody had already starved to death. There was nobody left. They're all dead. So you can't look at it. You can't ever find out anything about it. So it tells us that those who actually run the South Korean security state, in reality, the US imperialists, are afraid of South Koreans experiencing life in the North, because whatever else it might be, it isn't the cartoon that is drawn by the propagandists, and they're bitterly afraid that more South Koreans might get interested in reunification if any of that repression was relaxed. Absolutely.
One has to understand, the first thing to understand about South Korea is it is a colony. It is occupied land. One thing we saw when we were there was US military bases, and they are enormous. They're like little cities. And in fact, I'm pretty sure, again, forgive me if I'm giving wrong information, I'm pretty sure that the world's biggest military bases away from, domestic soil are the US bases in South Korea. Now, the one in Seoul is absolutely enormous. And
so just to clarify there, Joti, just for the audience's benefit, Seoul is the capital of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, and there's a gigantic American military base right in the middle of the city.
Yeah, or sort of on the edge of it. But in the middle of the city, it's not funny, but in the middle of the city, there is a war museum which commemorates, and glorifies the alliance. They call alliance, they mean the occupation between the Republic of Korea and the USA. And at the moment, they were having big banners because it's 70 years, I think 70 years since the end of the Korean War, the war which the people of the North called the Fatherland Liberation War. the genocidal war that was launched by US imperialism to keep its control of the south of Korea. 3 years long, 4 million Korean people killed in that war, the most horrific, barbaric war you can imagine, one where the USA seriously considered using its nuclear weapons, the one where North Korea was helped to survive by the support of volunteer army from China and fighter pilots from the Soviet Union. You know, so it was a moment when the socialist camp really stood together. But if you look at a map, you start to understand, why is Korea such a target? Because the Korean peninsula comes down at a point where China and Russia / the USSR meet, right? And it's very close. Over here is Japan.
Mm.
So, and it's right in this part of the Pacific that, you know, if you're on that territory, you've got a base that can threaten the whole of the Pacific, that you can spy directly on Russia and on China. You can keep an eye on Japan, you know, on the Philippines, on, you know, this whole area is much easier to dominate if you've got your foothold there. And that's exactly what the US has made sure it's done. Geostrategically, it wants Korea. Number one, it definitely wants to crush the example of Korean socialism. But more than that, it wants to keep hold of this location for its base between Russia and China, these two big, as it would see, enemy powers. It wants to be able to spy on them, to threaten them militarily. It wants a justification for keeping all its warships in this part of the Pacific where it is not, right? The United States is not in this part of the Pacific. Russia is, China is, Japan is, you know, Korea is. The United States is not. So by having this base in South Korea, it has a justification for keeping all of its warships there. It keeps nuclear warships patrolling these seas, you know, and brings them constantly into harbor in South Korea, you know, directly threatening the people of North Korea constantly, you know. So when you look at the map, it's a really good idea when these wars are going on to look at a map and try and understand what role does this part of the map play in the thinking of the imperialists, who, let's not forget, you know, they want nothing less than global domination, and they see the world as a map, not as people, not as countries, not as lives. You know, they see very much, you know, if this bit of, you know, they talk about geostrategic, right? You know, it's always the imperialists who have this way of looking at the world. They see people, they see the world as a chessboard. They see people and even countries as their pawns, you know, to be moved about so that they can control this, that, and the other. And very much you can, if you look at a map with that mindset, you can understand why the imperialists are so keen on keeping hold of Korea.
Well, the other thing that they, of course, desperately want is that they desperately, in fact, don't want any Korean reunification that's not on their terms. In fact, any Korean reunification at all, because if you were to see the Korean proletariat, both sides of the border, achieve reunification on negotiated terms that truly achieve Korean sovereignty, you would have an industrial powerhouse, because you've got all the great achievements of the planned economy in the DPRK. You have a large amount of industry in the south, which has benefited from a certain amount of development of high-tech industries. You combine that together, then a united Korea ruled by a coalition government, perhaps, of the Workers' Party and the revolutionaries from the south, then you have an enormous power that would be capable of throwing off imperialism completely. So they don't want reunification. If they can't get the collapse of the North, they'll take the current status quo, which is perpetual colonization of Korea. And of course, their other gigantic military base in the region is on Okinawa in Japan. And so they control these two countries almost completely. And yet, when you read about it, it's always presented as, oh, no, we're there to stop, you know, Russia / China / the DPRK from taking over these countries. Where in actual fact, it's the American imperialists that sit there and put themselves above any law as well. Like, I think in Japan, they can't be prosecuted a lot of the time. They can't even be asked to leave. When the one Japanese premier 10 years ago from the opposition part of the Japanese Democratic Party basically tried to get the Americans to think about leaving Okinawa, Obama said, no, you don't get to tell me what to do. We tell you what to do. So this is the reality in all these countries. And I wondered what your impression of South Korea is as a country that is effectively colonized and occupied. What effect does that have, do you think, on the population and the culture there?
You've summed it up really well, Alex, in terms of what the US has to lose and what the people have to gain when you think about the prospect of reunification. You're absolutely right that a reunified and anti-imperialist Korea would be a global game changer. It wouldn't just transform the lives of the Korean people, which it certainly would, but it would create an anti-imperialist powerhouse that would inspire and be able to help, right, countries all over the world, because, as you say, has the combination of a powerful and experienced anti-imperialist government in the north with a planned economy and very advanced armaments, and of course, nuclear armed, which makes it very, very strong and able to defend itself. And then in the south, as you say, you've got these high-tech, advanced chip-making capacity, as well as a lot of agriculture and other industries, some other industries, which mean that you put those all together and you unleash the potential of all those people, and you've got something really that can change the game for the whole world. I think there would be a real domino effect of a revolutionary situation in Korea. And the thing is, I think it's closer than a lot of people would realize, because with the imperialist crisis deepening by the day, their war drive is becoming ever more rampant. It's actually, when you look at it with a human eye, it's insane, their war drive. But if you understand the motivation of capital and the desperation of the imperialists, the monopoly financiers, to save a system which is coming down around their ears, the only way they're going to do it is to smash all these centers of independence and to get to loot their resources, right? And looting the resources of Russia and China, Korea is seen as a stumbling block and another impediment to that aim. And it's like they can't help themselves, even though North Korea has made it really clear, look, we want peace. We want peaceful reunification. But reunification is our right. And ultimately, we won't be stopped from reunifying Korea. One way or another, the Korean people will reunify. And the USA is actually forcing a situation where that's going to be sooner rather than later. It's a bit like with Taiwan and China. If the USA keeps pushing to war with Taiwan, they're going to get the war they asked for, and it won't have the result that they're hoping for, right? It's going to have the result of China moving to reunify with Taiwan, by force rather than through peaceful negotiations that they've been trying to pursue for decades, but the USA always gets in the way. Exactly the same problem in Korea. The peaceful reunification is wanted by both sides, but the USA constantly acts to get in the way. And now they've put this puppet fascistic dictator, Yoon Suk-yeol, in the government in the south. He is absolutely prostrating himself before the war hawks. He is ratcheting up the war rhetoric and joining with every exercise that's demanded of him. Literally every week there's a new joint exercise. And more than that, as part of this war drive against North Korea and against China, there is a massive drive to remilitarize Japan. And, the Korean people have a strong memory of the crimes committed against them by the Japanese. And rapprochement with Japan without a proper acknowledgement of these crimes and some kind of restitution is very, very unpopular. And yet, Yoon Suk-yeol is constantly offending the feelings of the Korean people by prostrating himself also before Japan. and accepting everything that's asked of him, and celebrating, the new alliance of Japan, South Korea, and the USA, and Japanese troops are, also joining with these anti-DPRK war drills, which are essentially rehearsals for invasion, for nuclear attack, rehearsals for decapitating the leadership of the DPRK. And every one of these rehearsals, the DPRK is forced to respond as if it might be the real thing, because you never know when it's going to be. So whatever happens in Korea, and it looks to me like they're pushing so crazily that something is going to happen before very much longer. Whoever appears to fire the first shot in that particular moment, be in no doubt it's a war whose blame lies entirely with US imperialism and nobody else, and we should definitely, make sure that people in the working class movement and the anti-war movement understand that, when the war breaks out, it's definitely been provoked by the USA and forced on the Korean people, and for them, they're fighting a just war, a national liberation war, and a national reunification war. So that's something that we have to really, make sure people understand. You were asking, sorry, I sidestepped your question there, but to come back to your question about what effect it has on Korean society. Well, of course, the people I met in South Korea are the revolutionary people. They're the militant trade unionists. They're the militant women activists. They're the militant communists. So I can only tell you things that they told me. I can't tell you my experience of meeting the kind of Koreans that I might refer to. It's slightly secondhand information because I wasn't there for long enough. But what I got the impression is that there's and I meet a lot of the young comrades in the PDP. Many of them are students or are former students who dropped their university studies, having decided that giving their life over to the sausage machine of work hard, get good exam results, get a good degree so you can get a job, so you can have a family and live in one of these battery flats and just keep going under loads and loads of stress and pressure, basically being a cog in this machinery of a super oppressed and very kind of depressing state, was a waste of their lives. They wanted to fight for the country's liberation and reunification, and they joined the PDP. And that's something I'll come back to in a second, if I may, about the way the PDP actually operates, that I think is really important lessons for the rest of us in the movement. But they tell me a story very much of a demoralized and degenerate culture that looks a lot like the worst, many of the worst elements of Western culture, demoralization, kind of screen obsessions, these, the kind of the explosion of gender dysphoria issues like we're having, alienated young people essentially, and explosion in plastic surgeries, and obsession with or pushing of American or the Korean version of American YouTube culture, the kind of K-pop and, weird plastic surgeries people have to make them look the right way. And all of this hyper-individualization that comes with a very alienated, kind of broken, late capitalist type of society development. And even though capitalism in South Korea is a kind of quite stilted and one-sided, because it's a colony, it's been developed in some ways and kept back in others. It has a very lopsided economy, not a decent or not an all-rounded capitalist development, you'd say. It's very much an adjunct to the USA. So they outsource things they want it to do. And in those senses, it's sort of developed, but in other ways, not at all. But as a colony that is part of this kind of whole high-tech development and plays its particular role there, there is and because of this sort of imported American culture, you see very much those same symptoms that we see in the most decayed Western countries, particularly in the USA and in Britain, of a kind of alienated, individualistic, degenerate, broken kind of mindset, particularly amongst the younger people.
Yes, that's the worst elements of Western culture combined with the sort of weird local spin on it to create this sort of uniquely awful culture that you also see in Japan as well. It's like the adopting of all the worst elements of American imperialism combined with the local degeneracy to create something uniquely awful. Not very appealing at all, but this is the effect of long-term occupation, which is the colonization of, well, the mind as well, to draw from writers like Frantz Fanon.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to get your take on is that the survival of and the continuation of the Korean Revolution in the North is something which is, in my view, not taken seriously by so-called Marxists in the left, in the Western left at all. It's very rare that you'll find anybody who studied it. It's very rare that you'll find any opinion on it that is not taken straight from the pages of The Guardian or The Times. So I wanted to just get your take on like the importance of studying the DPRK and its example, because this is a country which has survived almost as long now without its former, one of its biggest trading partners in the old USSR, and through an enormous period of difficulty in the 1990s. And yet the revolution there continues. And this is probably why it's not talked about except in aggressive terms, and why it's not studied except through the medium of propaganda. But what do you think about the importance of the DPRK and why those of us in the West should make a proper effort to study and understand it?
DPRK is hugely significant, a country. And as you said, particularly because they found a way to navigate. First, Kim Il-sung was brilliant enough to find a way to navigate the Sino-Soviet split in a way where he didn't have to take sides. He remained on good friendship terms and trading terms with both the Soviet Union and China all the way through that period. Now, that is no mean feat. You know, at a time when everyone was demanding loyalty, to be able to say, well, it's not in our interests to choose between our two important friends. We need both of you, but we're going to also keep to our own way, right? And not just try and not see ourselves as anybody's lackey or anybody's adjunct. You know, we are doing socialism for Koreans in Korea. Of course, we want to be in alliance with all the other socialist states. We need that alliance against imperialism. We have an occupation that threatens us daily, you know, hourly. We can't be at odds with our socialist neighbors. And so that was the first kind of real sign of a particular brilliance about Kim Il-sung's leadership of Korea, I think. Following that, of course, the terrible situation, they call it the arduous march in North Korea, when the Soviet Union was no more, and nor was Eastern Europe. And so suddenly a whole load of trading partners were gone. And the people of North Korea were really seriously affected by that. They also had some years of difficult harvest, you know, bad weather compounded these problems. But the biggest problem I think they had was to do with energy, which is why they entered into negotiations for peace with the Bill Clinton administration. They made a deal where they would give up developing nuclear weapons if they would be given nuclear light water reactors to help them get energy. So if the USA would deliver these reactors and they would work and the country could have energy, they said, okay, we will for now freeze our nuclear development program. Of course, they fulfilled their side of the bargain and the USA broke its side, as happens so many times to so many people. And after many years of trying to push them to deliver, they said, well, forget you, we're doing it ourselves then, which, you know, is the perfectly sensible response. But through all of this time, you know, there's many horror stories about how many millions of people died in North Korea. I'm not convinced that they're true. I know it was a really difficult time. I know that there was a kind of rationing that meant some caloric restriction, for sure. But my understanding is that because they're a planned economy and a socialist society, they basically spread it out among the people so that everybody, although they had to literally tighten their belts, eat a bit less, have a bit less, they got by. They didn't have a famine. they had hardship, and it was really, really hard, but they picked themselves up, despite everything, despite the fact that China at that point, was not being the best friend it could be to the DPRK. Russia was gone. The USA was doing everything it could to pile on the pressure and push for its collapse. And it didn't work, and when you consider what a small country it is and how it's been divided, and the best of the arable land was in the south, and a lot of the industry was in the south, most of the big part of the north is mountains, despite all of that, and despite all the difficulty of having to become overnight self-sufficient, which ask the Cubans what that's like, right? When you've been able to trade with other countries who are your allies, and suddenly they're not there, and overnight a small nation has to like work out how to be self-sufficient. Of course, that is incredibly hard. And when you look at the fact that the US imperialists and the British imperialists, the imperialist gang, they didn't say, oh, the people are suffering, how can we help them? They said, oh, the people are suffering, good. If they suffer a bit more, they might get rid of this awful socialist government. Pile on the pressure. So just at that moment when things are getting bad, the imperialists rub their hands and say, how can we make them worse? That's exactly how they used COVID around the world. Look at every anti-imperialist country found that the imperialists used their control of the financial system, of the big pharmaceutical companies, etc., to blackmail and coerce and to strangulate countries which were trying to fight the pandemic. Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, they've all got horror stories to tell you of how difficult a difficult situation was made more difficult. Nicaragua is another one, by the strangulating effect that was intensified, purposefully intensified by the imperialists, because they saw an opportunity to make a bad day worse and see maybe this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and blackmails the people into overthrowing their government. I mean, this is literally how the imperialists operate. They don't see people, they don't see people's lives, they see an opportunity to get their way. And if killing off a few hundred or a few million people is the price for getting their way, to them it literally is of no account. They just want to get their way, as I said. So sorry, I've come back to what we were talking about. Did I answer your question?
Well, yes, the importance of the DPRK and the importance of us as communists in the West studying its example. Yeah,
so there are many things we can learn from the Koreans, and in particular I think almost more than anything is their spirit. They have held together their revolution by following and studying the leadership of the great Kim Il-sung, who was a brilliant Marxist and a brilliant revolutionary. They have stuck to their own path. They have said, look, we know that a planned economy is the key to fighting every battle. And no matter how difficult the imperialists make it for us, if we ditch our planned economy, it will only get worse. So they refuse to do it. And they've understood that fundamental essence of socialism is the planned economy, and that with a planned economy and with the people brought together, you can achieve anything that, despite the difficulties that are put in your way. It might be slower than it would have been. It might be more difficult than it would have been. But ultimately, when you have the people harnessed together, the power unleashed through a planned economy, it's incredible the things you can achieve. And if you look at the economic development of North Korea, they've achieved so many things that everybody said they would never do and could not be done, but they have been done, and they are being done. And you can't imagine 70 years ago, when General Douglas MacArthur was bombing Pyongyang into the dust, and he said it will take 1,000 years for that city to rise again. And he was really happy about it, obviously. But, by the 1980s, it was a thriving city. If you look at photos of Pyongyang today, you will see it's a really modern and beautiful city. And what's really interesting, I think, is that we maintain this sort of ridiculous notion. The imperialist media encourages, and we accept, workers in the West, we accept this narrative of Korea as this, kind of backward and benighted place where everybody's starving. And yet they're putting up satellites, they're developing nuclear weapons, they have weapons that the USA doesn't have. You can't do those things without a serious scientific and technological base. It isn't possible, right? You don't do it with everybody starving and living on beans, and then over here there's this amazing nuclear facility. Like, you have to have all the industries that support all of that, the research and development, the education system. You do not have this in a bubble over here. And the idea that perhaps it's some like, oh, they just have a lot of funding for one section of society and nothing for anything else. It doesn't hold water if you stop and think about all the layers of society that have to work. I mean, one of the reasons the USA worries about China and how China's surging ahead is because China has the ability and does, you know, China creates a huge number of STEM graduates every year, right? Yes, you probably can remember better than me what it stands for, right? The
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
There you go, thank you. So in Russia's educational system still has the legacy of the Soviet educational system, right? That hasn't all been destroyed. And what it means is that your average high school student in Russia has better maths than a lot of graduates from top level schools like colleges, universities in the USA. Right?
Yeah, well, this is the other thing. They don't want that level of scientific, technological, and engineering and mathematics base being strong in any country, because what they're meant to be is a source of cheap labor into the global imperialist system. They're not meant to develop their own technological base, which is why the agents of imperialism in Russia worked so hard to destroy the old Soviet education system. It's why they're so worried, as you say, Joti, about China. It's why they're terrified of the DPRK's example of being able to do all these high-tech feats of engineering and science whilst under siege, because it gives it gives lie to the the propaganda of the imperialists that it is the best of all possible worlds inside the imperial center, when in actual fact that just isn't true. The Chinese are outpacing the US imperialists in a number of areas. The Russians are in certain areas, specifically hypersonic missiles in terms of weaponry, but also now in other areas as well. Now they're diversifying their economy, which is really, as you were saying, what this crisis is all about. The contradictions of US capitalism has meant that it actually has hollowed itself out. And to rescue itself, it now needs to destroy its rivals. Which does lead me to final question I wanted to go into with you, which is like, what is your assessment, and what is the assessment of the anti-imperialist platform of where we are now, which is that the war in Ukraine has reached a certain point where it is now acknowledged by almost everybody, even pro-imperialist observers, that this Ukrainian counteroffensive is just a complete horrific slaughter of Ukrainian working class men, mostly. And who have been flung into this very well prepared Russian defense, which has been prepared for 9 months for this. They have no air cover, they have no naval power. They're just being flung like World War I soldiers, basically, but in even worse conditions. So what do we think the move of the imperialists is now? Because the only dispute that seems to be taking place in US circles is, well, do we go after China more, or do we continue to go after Russia, or do we send Poles to die in large numbers in Ukraine? So what's your assessment of where things stand at the moment and how it fits into that broader anti-imperialist struggle that's going on?
Well, sadly, I don't have a crystal ball to say the exact moves that are going to make. What I will say is the crisis of the system is so deep, and the predicament of the imperialists is so terrible in terms of the viability and the future of their system and their ability to keep looting the world, that this war drive is going to escalate, despite the fact that all human logic says, back out now while you still can, mate. It's really obvious that they're losing against Russia. It was obvious from the first day that they would, but the logic is that they're going to keep trying, and I think they're going to keep grooming proxy forces, unfortunately. I mean, as you said, the tragedy of the lives that are being lost, and the more that are going to continue to be lost while populations allow themselves to be groomed by the imperialists in this way, they will throw as many men as they can find into that grinder. in the hopes that eventually Russia will start to tire. We've got a foreign policy establishment, if you like, now, which since the days of the collapse of the Soviet Union has become so detached from reality. They were like, we won the Cold War, the enemy is gone, we're the kings of everything. And they moved from being kind of cautious in the sense that they had a rival power that was a peer competitor, if you like, that was as strong as they were, and therefore they had to have a little bit of they had to temper their arrogance, and they had to be a little bit realistic, and they had to invest a lot in trying to understand their enemy, right? Well, what's happened since then is they basically have, the people who get promoted are the people who say what they like to hear. They say, we're the only power in the world. No one can touch us. No one can match us. No one can stand up to us. And all we have to do now is wipe out all the remaining centers of existence, and we'll just be the number one forever. I mean, that was the plan for the new American century, right? Wipe out every remaining center of anti-imperialist resistance. Boom, 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 7 wars, 7 years. That'll be done. And we'll be the kings of everything forever, right? That was their plan based on the Soviet Union's gone and now no one can touch us. That isn't how things have worked out, but the ability of the people who advise the ruling class to understand that is severely limited by the fact that they're all people who got promoted because they said the right thing. And they worked out what the right thing, they got good at knowing what the right thing was to say. What do people want to hear? I mean, how did Liz Truss get to be prime minister? Because she spent 20 years as a proper little bourgeois careerist learning how to say things that people around her wanted to hear. That's literally what she's good at and what she knows how to do, right? And you find the whole, the State Department in the USA and the White House is full of these types of people. They don't know Russia or China. They've got used to being in this echo chamber where they tell each other things. Russia's like a gas station parading as a country. Russia has an economy the size of Texas. Russia this, Russia that, and it sounds good. And while they're not having to test any of it out in practice, they just keep getting promoted. It's like the people who write the history books that say, Stalin killed 60 million people, and then someone comes along and writes a history book that said Stalin kills 80 million people. It doesn't need proof. He gets a big paycheck, and it's like a kind of one-upmanship, right? Well, you feel like the offices of state and the think tanks in the West have become full of these types of people because of actually the fact that for a little while the US clearly was the number one power in the world, and in its arrogance and its cocksure kind of sense of, now we can take the gloves off and just do what we want and no one can stop us, they let that idea get away from them, really. And now that reality is coming back to bite them, and the truth of the fact that the anti-imperialist world and bloc never went away, the whole of socialism didn't collapse when the USSR collapsed. A big and very important part of it did, but some socialist countries remained. Other anti-imperialist countries remained. The USA's 7 wars in 7 years didn't work out, did it? How long were they in Afghanistan? 20 years. And who won? Not the USA, not Britain, right? It was the Afghan resistance that won at the end of 20 years. Who won in Iraq? The USA didn't even get control of all the reconstruction contracts in Iraq. Never mind, they didn't get the government that, was totally under their control in Iraq. So none of these wars, despite everything they put into them, and despite the arrogance with which they went in, and the fact that they were fighting against countries that couldn't, where they could bomb with impunity. They've got this idea now that fighting a war means taking your bombers over the top of populations that have no air defenses and no air force to fight back, and just smashing the whole country to smithereens, destroying everything that makes life livable, and saying, haha, right, now we're in charge. They think that's a war. They're not prepared for what they're coming up against with the Russians, and particularly they're not prepared because they lost all the people who could have advised them. And anyone who tries to advise them in terms of reality, what they're really facing is very quickly sacked or demoted or sidelined. So they've now got this kind of self-reinforcing echo chamber where they're unable to recognize reality, but that in itself is a symptom of the crisis and decay of imperialism. And the flip side of that is their desperation to save their system and get hold of the loot, which they badly need. They badly need some way to make a profit when all the other sources of profit are drying up and they have so much capital, they don't know what to do with it. They're so desperate for this loot that nothing's going to stop them to keep trying, chucking their proxies in. Like you said, we are seeing how the mentality of World War I is fully alive and well amongst the finance overlords of the world. They see individual humans as nothing, as Untermenschen, and totally disposable. Remember Madeleine Albright about the, 500,000 Iraqi starved children? It was worth it. Well, that's exactly how they feel about the Ukrainians that they're massacring right now. It's all worth it. They're sending to be massacred. Not massacred. The imperialists are responsible for a massacre of Ukrainians. They're sending them to be mown down by Russian guns. The Russians have tried, I think, very hard not to make it such a grinding war from the beginning. They didn't want to kill lots of Ukrainians, but the choice has been taken out of their hands. For as long as these people allow themselves to be the proxies of the imperialists, they are essentially signing their own death warrants and the death warrant for their country as well. I don't see right now much prospect that the same voices who say we should try and find an exit are going to come out on top. I think that people who have committed to this war are just too committed. And it's that thing of, if you wait for a bus for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, the longer you've been doing it, the harder it is to walk away, right? But a bus might come now. Right? Like, yeah, but if we just put one more little bit of one F-16s, I mean, now they're throwing around the idea that maybe tactical nukes are the thing to give the Ukrainians, So one more escalation will be the one that topples Russia's government. That's what they're aiming at. If we can topple Russia's government, we can get in there and start to dismember Russia and control its resources and have a field day with everything inside its economy. But trying to provoke a situation where that happens is their aim. What happens to all the people they use in the process? They don't care. Meanwhile, you're right, there's this debate going on in the State Department and the Pentagon in the USA where people are saying, yes, but we really need to do something about China, right? That's the imperialist mindset. They've got to destroy the independence and loot the resources of China. This is a desperate imperative for the imperialists because of the state their system is in. And so, again, there's this kind of, some people say, yes, the route to China is through Russia. Weakening Russia, destroying Russia will make China weaker. Therefore, we just put everything into Ukraine. And others who say, no, we need to face China more quickly. We need to get on with dealing with China. And Ukraine's getting in the way now of that. They're worried that with every week, month, year that goes by where they're not attacking China's getting stronger. And of course, they're right about that. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, China's already too strong for the US to do anything in terms of bringing it down or just destroying its independence or getting hold of its resources. But their imperative is to do that, and the crisis in their system is such that they can't let up with that drive. No amount of logic and reason can make them see that it's not going to work out. They have to try.
The crisis of imperialism necessitates ever more aggressive actions, which is why understanding imperialism is probably certainly the most vital task for those of us who are active in the imperialist countries. Joti Brar, as always, it's been a great discussion. And if people want to find out more about the World Anti Imperialist Platform, we'll put the link to the platform in the show description. But until next time, thank you for joining us today.
Lovely. Thank you for having me.